I'm Erin Fitzgerald, the director of Salve Regina's Office of International Programs, and each year our office celebrates International Education Week. And this is a nationally sort of celebrated event which simply marks the importance of the movement of people for the purpose of educational and cultural exchange and cooperation. So this year our team in the Office of International Programs, we thought it was fitting to use our celebration to join in the larger celebration of the United Nations as it turned 70 years old. And I didn't think of bringing a birthday cake, as one of the audience members suggested earlier, but it would have been fitting. Happily, the Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy agreed to partner with us on this event. And that, of course, is very fitting, because Senator Pell, which I didn't really realize, was a delegate at the San Francisco conference in the spring of 1945, one of the conferences out of which the UN Charter was born. Also, I learned just yesterday from Jim Ludis, the director of the Pell Center, another little interesting bit of trivia about Newport's connection to the early years of the United Nations. And that is that Ochre Court, which I think most of you would know, is the estate just a few doors down from here, which is now the administration building for Salve Regina University. Back in 1946, the family that owned Ochre Court, the Goulet family, offered the estate up as a potential site for the United Nations headquarters. Some of you are nodding, so you might have already known this history. It's obviously the site was visited and was not selected to be the headquarters for the United Nations, but I think it's worth just pausing, especially for those of you who have lived your whole lives in Newport, and thinking about how would Newport look and what would it be like if in fact we were the United Nations headquarters today. It'd be very different. So today, at 70 years old, the United Nations is a mammoth and complex organization employing over 40,000 individuals around the world, an array of different programs and specialized agencies and funds, some of which have become household names and which we might not, some of us, especially the students, might not necessarily automatically connect with the United Nations. UNICEF, UNESCO, the World Health Organization, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, as well as running, as one of the speakers has pointed out, it's important to distinguish peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace building, stabilization, and humanitarian operations on a daily basis around the globe. So, as with any individual organization that turns 70, there have been some highlights and lowlights in those years, some good times and some bad times. So this is an anniversary, and we're considering it not just as a moment to celebrate, but also a moment to look back and reflect on the past of the UN and also what lies ahead for the UN. And it's in that spirit that we have invited our two speakers here tonight, or sitting here, and they're going to help us, I think, with this. We've decided to sort of flip the order. So our structure for tonight is that our first speaker is going to give us a sense of what lies ahead, and to look specifically at the recently ratified Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, which I think are pretty ambitious. And then after he's had his chance to share his remarks, then we will be looking at the broader context, the broader history of the UN with our second speaker. And when they have finished their remarks, they're going to join us back on stage, and after both those segments, we'll be able to take some questions from the audience, and we do hope to make it more of an interactive event, but certainly we need some context and information on which to base that discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to our first speaker, Matthias Kledermeyer. And Matthias is a public information officer in the Division for Sustainable Development at the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. So Matthias.
Thank you very much, and I want to start by thanking the hosts, the Pell Center and the Office of International Programs of this university for hosting us. I think it's very important that we from the United Nations leave our offices sometimes and come and talk to the people we work for. In the end, our work is for everyone. And it's important, I think, to come here, explain what we do, and also give you an opportunity to question us, ask us questions about our work. And that's why we're here, and thank you very much for this opportunity. And I also didn't know that this town was being considered as a possible headquarters. I must say it's very beautiful. It was the first time I'm here. We had a short tour yesterday. And I'm not very happy when I think back about the First Avenue in New York, where we'll have to head back tomorrow. So yeah, it is very pretty, and we hope to come back. So as was announced, I will be talking about the Sustainable Development Agenda that was adopted just this September. I'll start with a question, a quick show of hands. Who's heard of the new Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations? Some of you, okay, that's great. Now these are the goals that the UN will be working towards for the next 15 years, so it's a big thing. And it took quite a while to come up with them, and I'll explain why and how this was done, and how they are also a shift in development thinking for the UN. I'd like to start with this picture, also going back to what I said earlier. As you may know, the UN headquarters on the East River was constructed in the 1950s, and at the time it was actually very free, so you could just walk in and visit meetings. If you visited the UN recently, you know that it's more like airport security to come in, which is a shame, but apparently necessary. But that's another reason why I think it's so important to have these events and to explain the work of the UN and come here. The structure, I'll give you a very brief history of the context of sustainable development. Then I'll briefly talk about the Millennium Development Goals and how these contrast to the Sustainable Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals were the sort of predecessors of the SDGs. And then I'll talk a bit about the key aspects of this new agenda. I also like to start by saying sustainable development, or economic and social development, was a key aspect of the UN's work from the beginning. Of course, what we do is mandated by the UN Charter, and all the way up there in Article 1, it outlines economic and social development. So that's always been one of the objectives of the organization in itself, but also, as outlined later, as a means to another end, as a means to peace and security. So it has this double role, and this new agenda is the first one which includes peace and security in a development agenda at the UN, which is considered a big step because very often there were political sensitivities with bringing these agendas together. So we see it as a very positive step that member states actually took this step and brought this agenda together. You may know this picture. It's from signing of the Declaration 1945, which means, of course, as was mentioned, it's the 70th birthday. I won't sing happy birthday, so I'll spare you that. Definition of sustainable development, of course, there are many. There's a very classic one which says that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generation to meet their own needs. So it's really about this aspect of intergenerational justice. And there are actually some countries that have ombudspeople for future generations who, when laws are passed, look at how these laws might affect people who will live in 50, 80, 100 years. So that's a key aspect of thinking about sustainable development. And one thing I also like to stress at the beginning is these three dimensions of sustainable development. Often people associate sustainability with environmental policy and greening. And that's, of course, a very important aspect. But what we've been trying to work on at the UN is to make clear that it's really about integrating three dimensions of sustainable development: the environmental, the economic, and the social dimensions. Because there are many interlinkages between these three aspects. And in the past, when looking at them individually, we missed some of these interlinkages. So one big new aspect of this new agenda is that it integrates these three dimensions, and it's really about bringing these together. Quickly, the historical context. Of course, it's been 70 years, a lot has happened, but I think for sustainable development, I'd like to point out three increases that have taken place that are particularly relevant. One is the scope of the UN's work has increased considerably since 1945. Second, the focus on individuals has increased. And thirdly, the participation of non-state actors, of non-governments, has also increased. And I think these are all things that you can see reflected in this new agenda, and I'll outline them now. So increase in the scope of the UN work. You know these guys, and I won't talk too much about this aspect because I know that my colleague will be talking more about peace building, peacemaking. So I'll just repeat what I said. It's the first time that peace and security are part of a sustainable development agenda. And that was hard work to get it in there, and that's quite important. Just as an example, the head of the UN Development Program last year in an interview said that in Syria, about 30 years of progress have been destroyed in only 4 years. So that shows that we have to see these two things together and consider them together in order to make the progress the way we want to. Of course, there are many new issues that have come up. You can probably guess what I mean by this picture. Global warming. It's the poor polar bear. And of course, when the UN Charter was signed in 1945, global warming was not an issue. It just wasn't on the horizon in any way. And it is now, and that's sort of, you'll see that included in many things that the UN does now. Also AIDS, Ebola. There's diseases that keep on coming up that were not considered back then, and that have to be included in these new agendas to address the issues we seek to address. World Toilet Day, that's something that the founders of the UN probably didn't think we would be celebrating, but health and sanitation issues are actually very important. There's over 2 billion people who don't have regular access to clean sanitary facilities, and there's over 1 billion people who have to practice open defecation because they have no access to toilets whatsoever. And that actually leads to a lot of infections in small children, is one of the main reasons for children under 5 dying in developing countries. So these things are all very linked, and we recognize more and more of these interlinkages, and that's why it's quite a broad agenda, because it was important to do justice to these interlinkages in this new program of action. One Secretary General said there's more and more problems without passports, as he put it, basically meaning these are issues and problems that aren't confined to one nation or to one country or to one peoples, but that cross borders, and so solutions also have to cross borders and also have to be come up on a global level. Second increase I mentioned was the increase on individuals. What I mean by that is, if you read about the economic development of a country, you still often read about GDP as an important measure. And it is an important measure, but it tells you more about how an economy is doing and not necessarily how individuals are doing. So it doesn't tell you if inequality is increasing or, let's say, if people are getting sick because of pollution. So the idea of human development was developed to grasp a bit more the things that might be important to individuals, to people. The basic idea is that economic growth will not automatically lead to desirable outcomes for people, but that you have to look at what is important in people's lives and enable them to have choices in life. And these are things like give them social services, give them freedom from fear, enable them to understand healthcare choices, and so on. It's essentially about expanding the choices that people have and that they can make about their lives. You know this gentleman? He's my boss. I don't work with him on a regular basis, but I have seen him in the elevator twice. I don't think he'll remember me, though. And he brought out a report last year, which was called A Life in Dignity for All, and in a way that also sums up in 6 words nicely what we try to achieve with this human development, is to enable everyone to have a life in dignity. The third change I mentioned was increase in the participation of non-state actors. What I mean is, again, comparing with 1945 and thinking of some of the NGOs that are around, Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders, Oxfam, these all have a lot of expertise, they have a lot of knowledge. They have offices doing work on the ground, which complements the work of the UN. So it absolutely makes sense for the UN to work with them and to also benefit from their expertise. And this is happening more and more. And the way this current Sustainable Development Agenda was developed was these organizations were also given an opportunity to give their views and to give their views on the goals, on the targets, and so on. So this cooperation has actually improved a lot through the past, and so this is seen as a very good thing. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the Global Compact. It's a similar attempt to work with private enterprises and the private sector, because again, there are very large companies out there. There's a lot that can be achieved in cooperation with them. there's divided opinion. Some member states say we have to be cautious not to work too closely to make sure that our respective agendas are kept separate. But pretty much most member states agree that it's important to partner with global actors, with global players that can make a difference, and that's what's happening too. So they also were involved in these negotiations of the new agenda by being able to contribute their views. And has anyone heard of the My World survey? This is something new, and this is basically enabled by new technology, by the internet, by social media. It's the world's, or the UN's largest survey, the largest survey it ever did. Over 7 million people participated. The idea is to also ask individuals for their opinions. In this case, it was before the goals were decided on, to ask them what they think is important, what should be included in this agenda. And of course, it's not, it's not a representative survey. The people who participated were mainly young people, mainly well-educated, but there were efforts made to reach people who don't have internet access, who are illiterate. So country teams did go to people and try to get as many views as possible. So I think it's a first attempt in this. We have new tools to engage with individuals now, and I think it's a first attempt. And again, I think it's valuable to try to interact with individuals as well. Second part, from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. Has anyone seen these icons before? Some of you, that's good. We've been using them for 15 years, so I'm happy that some of you have seen them. And basically the MDGs, as they're called, were the Millennium Development Goals, the 8 anti-poverty goals that were agreed on in the year 2000 to be achieved by the end of this year. We're doing good on some of them. We won't achieve all targets. It's hard to say how many we will achieve because there are several targets for each goal, and for some we're achieving them, for some we're not. But there's a general consensus among many people working around these goals that they were a very positive thing, that sort of setting goals rallied member states, development agencies, civil society organizations, individuals around certain objectives, and that this was quite successful. And that's why this new development agenda is also based on goals, these Sustainable Development Goals. I'll just mention a couple of things that were achieved. One of the goals was to cut in half extreme poverty, and that was achieved. In 1990, there were about 2 billion people living in extreme poverty, and now there's about 800 million. So this goal was achieved. A lot of educational targets have been achieved. The ratio of children going to school has gone up considerably, so it's also a very positive thing. And on diseases, also a lot has been achieved. Now, you will hear sometimes that a big part of the success was economic growth in countries like China, Brazil, which is true. It played a very important role, but growth alone, as mentioned earlier, is not enough. You also have the right policies to direct the benefits of this growth to people who actually need it, and to intelligent policies. So the MDGs are considered a success. Of course, there's always a downside too. Emissions of carbon dioxide have increased a lot since 1990. Also, there's these other 800 million who are still living in extreme poverty, and one major objective of the new goals is to actually eradicate extreme poverty, so to help these and to finish what the MDGs did not achieve. Some critical social and economic issues were not addressed by the MDGs. A big issue now in most countries is inequality. And now this applies both to wealthy countries and developing countries, that inequality is rising. So this is something which the new goals seek to address. And there's some structural issues like the sustainable or unsustainable consumption and production patterns, which we would like to change. And this next point goes back to what I said at the beginning. The MDGs were very important goals, but they focused mainly on the social aspect. So some of the economic and environmental aspects we need to address to make sure that these social gains are lasting were not addressed in this framework. So again, the new goals have more goals to try to address all of these dimensions. One kind of thinking behind this is that no matter what progress you make regarding poverty eradication, if then, for example, you have floods due to climate change, that progress will be destroyed. Or if people, take the resources from the ground, and then whatever gains you made is rolled back because people fall back into poverty. So the idea is to not only help people get out of poverty, but to make sure that they manage to stay out of poverty. So now I'll talk quickly about these Sustainable Development Goals. They were decided on at the Rio Plus 20 conference. You might have heard of it. It was a large Sustainable Development conference that took place in Brazil in 2012. And a lot what the UN is doing now in terms of sustainable development was decided on at this conference. Now this is the logo. It kind of tries to embody these three dimensions, with the red person being the social dimension, the blue ladder being the economic progress, and the green leaf being the environmental dimensions. Some people say it looks like a shark eating a drowning person. We do prefer the prior interpretation though. Now, one thing which is new about these SDGs is that there were actually a negotiation process to reach them. There were intergovernmental negotiations which lasted more than 2 years. So all countries in the UN could actually sit down, not at a table, but in the large conference rooms, and say what their priorities are and say what they want to have included in these goals. Because the Millennium Development Goals, they were essentially UN experts came up with them, drawing from previous commitments, but they weren't negotiated. So we feel that now, with all these countries having had a say in these new goals, there's a lot more ownership of these goals. And as mentioned, civil society also had opportunity to contribute, and it was a very transparent process. All the meetings were, or most meetings were webcast, so you could watch them live. So there's also broader ownership by civil society, which was an issue with the MDGs at the beginning because they didn't have this kind of role. So we think that there is broad ownership for these goals. And a big difference with these MDGs is that they're what the member states call universal. So it's not the classical aid agenda where you have certain goals for developing countries to achieve, but these are goals, first of all countries came up with them together. And secondly, they're for all countries to achieve, for all 193 UN member states, so wealthy and developing countries. Now, of course, these countries have different issues, especially wealthier ones and not so wealthy ones. But the idea is that there's something in there for everyone. If you think of sustainable consumption and production, as I mentioned, inequality or pollution, non-communicable diseases, health issues, there are enough issues that affect people in all countries, both rich and poor. And the idea is that countries who agreed this can now take those goals, those targets, which are relevant for them, over into their national policies. So the universality is something which distinguishes this agenda very much from all previous development agendas. Now, it's more goals than 8. It's 17 actually, which is quite a lot. So it's going to be hard to memorize them, but I'll quickly go through them just to give you an idea of what sort of the membership of the UN came up with are the issues that need to be addressed if we want to reach the kind of future that we want. And I'll only mention the headline goals, which are aspirational. These goals always have targets. So in all, there are 169 targets. I won't go through those because then we'll be here until midnight. But we can discuss these a bit maybe later in the Q&A session. I did want to mention 2 targets with the first goal because they kind of illustrate this idea that these are goals both on a global level and for developing countries and for developed countries. So the first target is essentially to finish the business that the MDGs did not finish, which is to eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere. That's the global goal, measured by people living on less than $1.25 a day. But then there's also the target which is aimed at every country to say that every country should reduce by half poverty by its own definition. So countries have different definitions. Of course, the US, also where I'm from, Norway, will have different definitions than some other countries. But these SDGs are made in a way that every country can take them into its strategy. Goal 2 is to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. So it's not only to fight hunger, but also to create the conditions that people will be able to continue producing enough food. Goal 3 is about health, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Goal 4 is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. So it's in MDGs focused more on getting children and people into schools. This also looks at the quality, the kind of education, looking at making sure that it's matched to the kind of knowledge that people need to actually get jobs. Goal 5 is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. Goal 6 is to ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. Goes back to what I said earlier. Goal 7 is to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. This is one goal where you can see that, again, every country can try to achieve or to improve energy efficiency. Goal 8 is to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. So these are more the harder economic goals that you didn't have in the MDGs. Goal 9 is to build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. Goal 10 is to reduce inequality within and among countries. Goal 11 is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And we know that at the moment, the ratio of people living in cities and in rural areas is about 50-50, but this will probably change a lot towards more and more people living in cities. So in 30 years, it might be something like 70-30. Of course, these are just projections, but it's going in that direction. And the idea is we can anticipate this, and then let's make the growth of the cities that will happen sustainable. Goal 12 is to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Goal 13 is to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. I should say that there's a separate treaty that will be decided on at the end of this year in Paris. Some people are shaking their heads, but we're very optimistic that a treaty will be decided on. And just to differentiate, this agenda is non-binding, so it's not a treaty. But the climate change treaty will be a treaty. So the main measures will be included in that Paris Agreement. Goal 14 is to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Goal 15 is a long goal. It reads like 3 goals. Protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation, and halt biodiversity loss. 16 is this goal on peace and security and justice for all that I mentioned. It's to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. And goal 17 is about the means of implementation, in other words, how these goals can be achieved. So these are a lot of goals, so we're going to have to work on, in our public communication, simplifying them a bit. And one way to do this, or one suggestion, which is also in this new agenda, is framing it in terms of the so-called 5 Ps. It's about people, prosperity, planet, partnership, and peace. And now I'll just quickly give you an overview of the key elements of this new agenda. It actually has more parts than only the goals. So the actual agenda has a declaration, then the Sustainable Development Goals, then a section on means of implementation, on how to achieve them, and then one section on review and follow-up. But I'll just mention the key aspects. First, it's an integrated agenda. As I mentioned, we're not looking only at social goals, but at social, economic, and environmental aspects. And of course, member states have stressed that the most important thing is to fight poverty and that people are at the center. But the way this works together is that we can only achieve the goal if we have a healthy planet and don't breach planetary boundaries, and also have sustainable, resilient economies. So these 3 elements are very much in there. Second, this is what I mentioned, the universal character. First time we have such an agenda for all countries to achieve. Negotiated, all 193 member states were part of this agenda. It's transformative. It doesn't only look at symptoms, but it tries to also address some key underlying factors, such as sustainable consumption and production. It's also nationally owned, so it's member states made very clear, and in the document it's very clear. It's not an agenda that was decided on by the UN, and now member states have to follow this, but it's member states themselves that decided the agenda and who will decide how they will integrate this into their national plans. And the idea is also that to come up with the resources and to look at how this will be implemented. This is something that countries will do themselves, of course. There's no question that official development assistance and other supports, including the provision of technology and so on, is also part of the agenda. But it's basically it's nationally owned, so every country owns their own agenda. I mentioned the peace and security aspects and human rights being recognized as part of the agenda, and it's nice at the 70th anniversary of UN that we now have an agenda which also includes human rights. Resources will have to be mobilized. It's not a classical aid agenda where you say, okay, now we need to find this money somewhere, but very often it's there. We just have to direct it into the right paths. I mean, one key aspect of financing this is, for example, tax collection. Many countries with more support and capacity development on tax collection can actually raise a lot of these funds themselves. And there's other means like technology transfer, trade, financing. There are several chapters on all of these issues in the agenda. Civil society will also be an important partner in realizing these goals. Also on, I mean, what the UN, where countries do ask the UN to help them draft national strategies that incorporate this new agenda, we do encourage them to include reviews and consultations by people who are actually affected. That means on regional level, on local levels, by the communities that are directly helping them achieve these goals and can give feedback. So that's an important aspect which we hope will be taken on board by member states. One of the most important mottos of this agenda is to leave no one behind. And for this we need disaggregated data, which means we will try to get data that shows how policies affect the various groups in society. Young people, old people, migrants, people of different ethnic backgrounds, disabled people. So it's important to make sure that not only to think in averages, because that was one sort of thing that didn't work as well as it could have with the Millennium Development Goals. As I mentioned, these the target on cutting in half extreme poverty was achieved, but in some countries there was a lot of progress. In other countries there was very little progress. But because we thought in averages, it was kind of seen as a success. But we have to make sure that we track what's happening in the different countries, in the regions, to the different people in the countries, to make sure that we can adapt the policies if they're not working for everyone. So these are the new icons, and when I come in 15 years, you'll all have seen them, so that's great. I'd like to say, if you want to know more about this, then follow our Twitter handle @SUSDev. I say this because we have very important information, but also because the more followers we have, the more praise I get from my boss. So if you want to follow that, that's great. And thank you very much. I'll be taking your questions afterwards, but I'll hand over to my colleague.
Great. Well, thank you, Matthias. That's a lot of information to digest, and I hope that you'll be thinking of some challenging questions for Matthias. But in the meantime, we're going to ask Jean-Victor Nicolo to come up and provide us a broader context. As you'll see in your flyer, Jean-Victor has worked at the United Nations for over 20 years, and he's held managerial positions in 10 United Nations peacekeeping missions. And moreover, he's previously served as spokesperson for 2 presidents of the United Nations General Assembly. And he said to me yesterday that because he was a spokesperson, he is prepared to answer any and all questions. So I think we'll be in very good hands. But first, let's give him a chance before the questions to offer his remarks. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I would very much like to walk you through the path of the United Nations, where we come from, and where we are heading to. The United Nations was founded 70 years ago. At the time, there were 50-something countries at the creation of the UN. Today, we have 193 countries, members of the General Assembly. But there are still some countries that are not part of the United Nations. Can somebody tell me which country is not part of the United Nations today? No, Cuba is?
Non-state countries.
No.
Non-countries.
Non-countries that are not in the UN. Yes? Switzerland? No, Switzerland joined a few years back, and actually The president of the General Assembly for the 65th session was from Switzerland, Joseph Dice. Yes? No, it's part of the UN. Taiwan. Kosovo is not yet a member state because it's contentious. Still, Taiwan is not a member of the United Nations. Another country. Palestine is a non-member observer state. The flag of Palestine was raised 3 weeks ago at the UN. And what is the other entity that is a non-member observer state with Palestine? Somebody knows? No, Israel is a full member state since 1948. Exactly. The Holy See is the second other non-member observer state. What does this mean? It means that for somebody like me, who was born in the mid-50s, my country, Cameroon, was not part of the countries that decided what the UN were going to be, whether they are going to set headquarters here in Newport or somewhere in Manhattan or somewhere else. So the rules, the charter, the chartering of the road forward, everything that was decided then was decided by the countries that were members of the UN then. Can somebody tell me one of the oldest countries of the United Nations, one of the founding members, but also one of the weakest? Yes.
You threw me off with the weakest one.
Say what you wanted to say.
Oh, I was going to say the United States and Russia were some of the founding members.
Yes, but not the weakest. Exactly. What is one of those countries, a country that is very weak, but a founding member? Yes? No. No, not German. These are not weak countries. Liberia, yes, but not weak at the time. But that's a good try. Haiti. Haiti is a founding member of the United Nations. Why? Can somebody tell me why Haiti was there at the very beginning? Haiti was there because it's the first independent black republic. When was that? When did Haiti gain its independence? Somebody knows? Since when? Haiti is an independent state. 1804. Why? Why is Haiti independent since 1804? Because Haiti is the only example in human history of slaves winning a military victory over their masters. Thanks to Toussaint Louverture, who is actually the gentleman who helped liberate Venezuela and Peru and other countries. A general who brought the slaves together and they defeated France. And since 1804, Haiti is an independent state, and since 1945, a founding member of the United Nations. And yet, there is a peacekeeping operation today in Haiti, a stabilization force. So the United Nations started with a group of countries, most of them wealthy, powerful, those countries that won the war, joined later by China, and if Taiwan is not a member state, it's because you cannot have two Chinas, only the People's Republic of China. And we went from 50, 51, 52, 53 countries up to 193. The big difference is that in the 60s, many African countries gained their independence, and also countries in Asia, like South Korea, is a relatively newcomer. And these countries did not only change the way the United Nations is constituted, not only in the numbers, but also in what they bring on the table. Some of these countries were very poor. Some did not really matter. South Korea, 50 years ago, is not South Korea today. Most of you have Samsung telephones from South Korea. 50 years ago, South Korea was more or less on the same development basis and assessment as Côte d'Ivoire, for instance. And yet, they've worked hard, they've gone very far. But also what these countries bring on the table means that the way the world looked in 1945 is not the way the world is today. We now have countries such as India, South Korea, Brazil, countries that we call the BRICS. You know, Brazil, Russia, India, the Korean countries, and all these countries bring a lot. In other words, countries that really were powerful, and that meant so much 50 years ago, the UK and France, do no longer have the same power. A country like India, today, in New Delhi, the Indian government opened a major conference, a conference between India and the whole continent of Africa. Just like Japan holds a conference between Japan and Africa. It means that this country now can bring much more than they could bring 50 years ago. Now, when we speak about countries being members of the United Nations, we have to understand that there are various organs. We have the Security Council that since 1948 has basically not changed that much. We still have 5 countries that have veto power. Can somebody tell me the 5 countries that can stop or change any decision within the Security Council? Yes?
France,
Yes.
Britain, United States, Russia, and China.
Excellent. And then you have 10 other countries that come to the United Nations Security Council on a rotation. They get elected every 2 years and they change. But it really means that if the Security Council wants to take a decision and do something and send peacekeepers to Newport because students here have gone unruly for some reason, the United States can say, no, we don't want to hear about that. And that will be it. The difference between the Security Council and the General Assembly, these are 2, we call them principal organs. ECOSOC, the Social and Economic Council, is also a principal organ. The difference between the Security Council and General Assembly is that the Security Council has the mandate for international peace and security. In other words, this is the entity that decides that if people in Haiti continue to fight each other, or if 2 countries fight each other, or if 2 countries are about to fight each other, they can decide what the next step should be. They decide on peace and security, and they adopt resolutions. And these resolutions can be for peacemaking, for peacekeeping, for peace enforcement, and they can even go further than that. They can refer cases to international tribunals so that leaders, people can be actually held, taken to court. Now, the General Assembly doesn't have a responsibility for peace and security. The General Assembly is a deliberative body where there is no veto power. Every member state at the General Assembly, whether it is powerful, not powerful, big or small, poor or rich, it is 1 member, 1 vote. That is why, for matters that are under the purview of the General Assembly, when there is a vote, such as recently the case of raising a flag for Palestine, there is a good chance that members will vote for their own conscience. Can somebody tell me a vote, can somebody recall a vote that took place a few days ago, yesterday or the day before yesterday, and that was quite stunning in the number of countries that voted in favor of that resolution. It concerned Cuba. Somebody knows what it was about? Yes. Lifting the embargo. And what are the countries that voted against? Can somebody remember? 2 countries voted against a resolution the day before yesterday to lift the embargo against Cuba. The United States voted against, and Israel, because these are countries that have a very strong alliance. Because Israel was founded in 1948 with a very strong support of the United States, and that was a very good thing because of what the Israelis and Jewish people went through, and because of the important role that the United States played in the liberation of the Nazi camps and the defeat of the Germans and so on. But the international community at the General Assembly does not necessarily vote as they would at the Security Council. And the United States does not have a veto power in the General Assembly. This is why the United States continues to be like isolated in the General Assembly on the question of Cuba. And after 50 years of voting no, 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 President Obama eventually decided to lift the embargo with the US administration, and now a few years ago, you still had like 4 or 5 countries, including countries such as Micronesia, voting in favor of the embargo. Now you only have 2. So one can suspect that soon there will be no more embargo. So you can say that the General Assembly is a bit more, how can we say, democratic, and the Security Council has this veto power. This brings the question of where is it that the United Nations is going with such organs. It is clear that the question of the reform of the United Nations, starting with the revitalization of the General Assembly, but most importantly, the decision by the member states to do what they can to reform the Security Council is really critical. But how can you convince countries that have a veto power to relinquish it? That will be very difficult. But the United Nations really has to reflect what the world is today, not what the world was 70 years ago. And that is a big challenge. You see, we started from a time when one of the key objectives was to somehow address the legacy of the World War. One of those legacies included people like me. My country was not independent. So Cameroon was put under the trust of the United Nations. And the body to do that is called the Trusteeship Council. So the British and the French, who defeated the German and who had 2 colonies from the German, Togo and Cameroon, told the United Nations, why don't you administer these 2 territories through the United Nations? And after a period of trusteeship administration, Cameroon gained its independence on 1st January 1960, and Togo gained its independence too in 1960, which makes that the United Nations actually has a very important impact on the history and on the fate of individuals and of countries. And I would now like to speak about the modern impact of this when we talk about peace operations. Sometimes we only think about failures, and we forget that to make peace means really showing goodwill. The United Nations doesn't have a magic stick where when there is a conflict, the United Nations is called upon, and then they bring the magic stick, and then they say, let peace be. It doesn't work like that. To keep peace, you need a peace to keep. In other words, before you can keep peace, you need the 2 protagonists, if there are 2, sometimes there are several, there are more than 2, who will accept that, yes, we are now ready to make peace, we have had enough of fighting each other, and we want an outside entity that will come and help us. It is not always the United Nations or United Nations only that is called upon to do this. Sometimes it's the regional organizations. A group of countries can come and support a peace process. But more than often, it is the United Nations, because the United Nations remains the only global institution that can address problems that a given country or a group of countries cannot address on its own. Let me give you an example of a successful peacekeeping operation. You must have heard of Mozambique. This is a country in southern Africa, a former Portuguese colony. After going through a colonial war against Portugal, Mozambicans start fighting each other. On one side, you had Frelimo, and on the other, you had Renamo. It was a brutal war. I mean, the stories of how brutal this war was, the stories are absolutely terrible. We cannot even repeat some of these stories here. But civil society, religious groups, starting with the Sant'Egidio community, which is part of the Holy See at the Vatican, invited the 2 protagonists, the representative from Frelimo and Renamo, to join them in Rome. And they put them in a nice house, and they said, we are locking the keys behind you, we are throwing these keys out. You are going to come out of this only when you have agreed that you will make peace. And after 2 years of negotiation, they agreed to make peace because they've had enough. There was nothing left to destroy in Mozambique. When I arrived in Maputo in the early 90s, at the beginning of a peacekeeping operation, there were only 4 taxis, 4 cabs in the capital of more than 1 million people. Well, today you have toll roads, you have highways. The country was destroyed. There were landmines everywhere. You cannot travel. You could not travel outside of the capital. So after 2 years, they agreed to make peace. But making peace is not only a word. You actually have to list the things that means peace, like sending soldiers back home, disarmament and demobilization. Sometimes those soldiers spent years in the bush, and the only thing they had on them was the uniform and a gun. The gun was for their survival. The uniform was the only thing they had on them. So when you send them back home, those who didn't go to school, what do they do when they go back home? Those who could go back to school had needed the means to go back to school. Those who could somehow adapt themselves or learn a trade like being a taxi driver or being a welder, you need to help them. So you list all those things that come out after a peace agreement: disarmament, demobilization, return of refugees, reestablishment of human rights, reinforcement of the capacity of the government so that the authority of the state can be reestablished throughout Mozambique, a very large country. All those things. Who is going to do that? The country was down, broken, no money. So they called upon the United Nations, and the United Nations sent a peacekeeping operation. And that peacekeeping operation was called ONUMOS. And ONUMOS had both a military, a civilian, a human right, and a humanitarian component. A military, because you actually need to demobilize soldiers. They still had weapons, and you had to make sure that the different parties will not go back home and then fight each other when they meet somewhere in the backyard or in the bush. So you had to have an orderly disarmament, demobilization, and more importantly, a reintegration into civilian life of those who fought. You needed a civilian component because ending the war doesn't mean it all. In Maputo, most schools were destroyed. The railway was destroyed. Roads were mined. So you need an anti-mine entity to remove the mines safely. You needed to rebuild the schools. You needed to reinforce the state. You need a humanitarian program with UNHCR bringing back refugees from Malawi, from South Africa, from Swaziland, and so on. And you needed all that. And you needed to reestablish human rights because a lot of crimes were committed during the Civil War. So you needed some kind of commission that would listen to what people had to say about what was done to them or what they did, so that you can record all that. And peace doesn't only mean signing a paper. It also means the peace of minds and the peace within our hearts. That is why a United Nations peacekeeping operation is complex. But you do not only have a peacekeeping operation, you can actually have a peacemaking operation. In other words, the Security Council can decide that if in a country, civilians, for instance, are such at risk because a ruler doesn't want to relinquish power even after losing elections, and that ruler has become a threat to its population, it is the responsibility of the international community to actually go in and do something about that. That's what happened in Côte d'Ivoire in 2010 when President Gbagbo, who is now a prisoner at the Hague Tribunal in the Netherlands, really didn't want to leave. So the UN had to send in helicopters, bombard the presidential palace. He was taken prisoner and he was taken to the Hague. And yesterday, the provisional results of the second election, the only second multi-party elections in Côte d'Ivoire, were announced. President Ouattara has been, for the time being, re-elected. The elections took place last weekend and results were announced yesterday. So there is a United Nations operation. And for instance, when I was sent to Côte d'Ivoire as a spokesperson of the mission there, my job, as instructed by the Security Council, was first and foremost to establish a radio station. Why a radio station? It was a radio station that will be there to announce the result of the election, because since each party had a radio station that they would control, it should be easy for them to just announce the results that they wanted. But a radio station was not only to announce results that will be credible and accepted by all. A radio station was also meant, first and foremost, to address the whole question of hate speech, like what we had in Rwanda. You know, when you get into a taxi in New York, and a taxi driver in New York sees a driver from New Jersey who is a bit lost, they'll say all kind of nasty things. Well, in Rwanda, there was a radio station before the genocide that knew how to belittle, how to insult the other ethnic groups, and in so doing, create a sentiment of hate against others. And within 100 days, hundreds of thousands of people got killed, thanks to the hate being fueled by Israel. So when I got into Cote d'Ivoire, I was told, why don't you start a radio station that will address, and if not reduce or eliminate, hate language, hate speech? It's extremely important to do that, because peace is not only a word. Sometimes peace is in the language, peace in our own behavior, peace is sometimes in the way we see the other. If we can be tolerant, peace can be sustainable. But we need to make it happen. So Cote d'Ivoire is a good example of peace enforcement. But there are also stabilization missions. The case of Haiti is one. A weak country, weak institutions, very powerful politicians instead of powerful institutions, and the UN was there to stabilize, which brings to my mind the memory of some of those United Nations workers, and people rarely speak about them, who sometimes get killed. We send our relatives, our friends, to go and work in various peacekeeping operations. Sometimes some don't return. It has happened to me as head of office in places, whether it's in Kosovo or in the Congo, to be called because one of our colleagues, a staff member, has been killed, whether it's a road accident or a clash somewhere. And it is very troubling. It is very sad to have to bring a coffin and to put your colleague and to send that colleague back home in a casket. It's something extraordinary. I do not wish you to go through that. And if you recall, during the earthquake in Haiti, the United Nations lost many staff members, in addition to the hundreds of thousands of Haitians who suffered the terrible consequences of that earthquake. But UN staff who were in Port-au-Prince, many of them were killed just because they had accepted or volunteered to go someplace and to help a population, but some never came back. Even though we know what the risks are, but I have to add that sometimes we also make mistakes. There are places, such as recently in the Central African Republic, when there are allegations that some of us have abused children or have committed human rights abuse. And these are the things we must address. Just like in every society, whether it is with civil service of the police, you always have bad apples. So we have to address that. And it is important, as Matthias was explaining, that in some of the goals, we now have the whole question of accountability. That is very important. But we also have, in addition to peacekeeping, peace enforcement, or stabilization missions, we have missions who are there just to observe, to make sure that a peace or a commitment that were made by various parties into a conflict, that these commitments are upheld. What is one of the oldest missions of such nature in the world? Somebody can tell me? Very old. Start from 1948. For instance, UNRWA is an agency of a mission that is there in the Middle East that is supposed to monitor what's going on in that very complex part of the world. Another mission that is now, decades old is one in Cyprus. In Cyprus, we still have people who are just watching, just like between India and Pakistan. There is a place where no side can cross to the other side, and we have to watch that. These are missions, and there is also another one that dates back from 1974, a disengagement mission in the Golan Heights in Syria. So there are all kinds of missions, all kinds of purposes, all kinds of definitions, various responsibilities, but beside the peacekeeping operations, you also have humanitarian missions, complex operations. I worked, for instance, in a very complex operation. After the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, I was assigned with some colleagues to run a refugee camp in Mugunga, in Goma. That was a refugee camp, 2 miles by 3 miles, 500,000 people at the height of the crisis, refugees. Most people who have fled from Rwanda found themselves at the foot of a volcano that was still active. That volcano is called the Nyiragongo Mountain. And I was there one night when we received Ari Belafonte, who was an ambassador of peace who came on behalf of UNICEF, and the volcano already started crashing lava. And you know, you have panic, and on a night like that, people will die. But people will not die if you have public information officers who can warn them beforehand and tell them, if you see the volcano going active, it is not going to reach you. We have created evacuation routes where if there's an emergency, you can start running all over the place before people are going to be trampled on. It's the same for refugees today who are roaming around Europe, or those who are trying to cross the desert or cross the Mediterranean to reach Europe. It is important that the United Nations continue to do a preemptive work, an information work that targets those people who are moving in irregular migration. Otherwise, you know, refugees in Central Europe can be walking on the railway track without knowing that this may be a track for a fast train. And before they know it, people can be killed. And this preventive work is not only humanitarian, it is also political. That is why the UN also have political mediation mission. In other words, missions that are not there to keep peace or to make peace, but just to prevent or preempt conflict. They know that there could be the seeds of a conflict somewhere, either because elections can be contested or because the political situation is shaky. So they go and start talking to people so that they'll find out what the problems are, what the challenges are, so that they can preempt things. And what are the biggest challenges that the UN is facing for tomorrow? I will say, first and foremost, it is the challenge for reforms. The UN needs reform. We all agree on this, but not all countries agree on what these reforms should be, how fast they should come. Some countries even believe that reforms may not be absolutely necessary now because this may serve their interest. But we all have to agree that the world is different, just like in a family. We don't think the same way. We are not the same, even though we come from the same mother and the same father. But all children don't see the same thing from the same perspective. So it is important that the General Assembly, such an important organ, remains a deliberative forum where member states can just come and discuss and talk. It is better to do that than to do that with weapons and so on. The next challenge, I believe, is that while the Security Council and other UN bodies, including what we call agencies or entities that report to General Assembly, such as the Human Rights Council or the United Nations High Commissioner for the Refugees, those entities were created after the World War. And basically, the United Nations had to face crises of refugees, famine, poverty, or conflict within countries or between countries. Today, a lot has changed. How do you fight Boko Haram? How do you fight terrorism? How do you fight anti-Semitism? How do you fight Islamophobia? How do you fight intolerance? These are the challenges of tomorrow. So the United Nations has to reform and be prepared, maybe change its toolbox and find out what will work, what can work for these new threats that were not there 70 years ago. How do you fight an enemy that from Syria to Iraq to northern Cameroon, Nigeria, Chad, has an alliance, and you do not know who they are, but they keep on arming young girls, young boys who blow themselves up in marketplaces? How do you fight that? How do you fight these enemies who wage an asymmetric war? Not a formal or a classical enemy. How do you solve that? And how do you fight an enemy that is convinced that death is the best thing that could happen to him or her? So these are very serious issues that really challenge the notion of the state as we know it, the notion of regional organizations as we know them, the notion of human rights and justice as we know them. But if you go to the root causes of these problems, you have to ask yourself, what is it that we did or did not do in terms of justice? Not only social justice, but also justice, as Matthias was saying, between those countries that have and those countries that have not. I remember when I joined the United Nations, one of the critical debates was the new information order. That was the unwritten war between those countries that had all the information and those other countries that didn't have information. One example I was giving today, if there is a job open at the United Nations or in an international agency, a young boy or young girl from Cambodia, or let's say from Nigeria, or from Swaziland, does not have the same internet speed to answer a written test like a young boy or young girl from Newton, or from Paris, or from Munich, or from Vienna. So how do we address that? How do we level a field where all the players believe that they have the same challenges, the same chances, the same risks, even though you can never have the same chance for everybody in life. But we must be careful in listening to the root causes and trying to address them. Otherwise, we may have fewer answers to really address terrorism. Because no one, not two countries, let alone the 193 countries, actually agree on what the definition of terrorism is. Today's terrorist may be tomorrow's liberation fighter or hero. Who knows? So, I mean, this is why, for me, I'm very optimistic when I see young colleagues like Matthias or Jihei, or when I come to a place like this. We interacted with some students today, and I see that they are open to the world. The world has become a very complex place. And if you believe that you should not address, or there is no need to address a crisis going on in West Africa, like Ebola, you are fooling yourself. You all followed the ambulances that were driving or flying some of these people affected by Ebola who were taken to Texas or to the United States. That's one reason why, for the first time in the UN history, both the Security Council and the General Assembly adopted a resolution to establish an operation, a UN operation in West Africa. This time, it was not about war or peace. This time, it was not about hunger, but it was to address Ebola, a global public health threat. Because if you do not address Ebola in West Africa, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, you will have Ebola here in no time. That is why it is important that a country like Haiti, one of the weakest, and yet a founding member of the United Nations, when they have a situation, we all have to go as a family of nations to go and help that weak country. Because if you don't, there are some allegations that the cholera epidemic in Haiti was imported from somewhere in Asia. Nobody did anything wrong, but these things happen. So if you do not address the weak health institutions in Haiti, if you do not address the weak political and administrative institutions in Haiti, and you believe that they are far away, well, the cholera epidemic, you will see people swimming all the way up to here, to the United States from Haiti. And that is why in Africa we believe that if your neighbor's village is on fire and you sit in your village and say, oh, that's a few villages far afield, not my problem. Be careful. The fire can go through the bush and reach your village in no time. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both our speakers. And we do have a microphone. Where is the microphone? That's Julia, is you ready with your...
Test.
For some questions from the audience. What's this? I'm sorry? Okay. So I hope that after those, I think, content-full presentations, that we will have some questions, particularly from our students in the audience. I do have a first opening question, perhaps, for Matthias, going back to the development goals. It's kind of a simple question, but maybe harder than it sounds. And of those 17 ambitious goals, for you as a person, is there one that you feel is sort of you're most optimistic about the success in 2030, 15 years from now? And is there one that you feel would be the biggest stretch for the organization and for the globe?
I think the most challenging one is probably the peace and security one, and creating institutions that are transparent and democratic everywhere. As we see, the situation in Syria is very difficult to solve. And so achieving this peaceful societies, that's quite different. It's also because it's something new, because it wasn't in the agenda before. It's also kind of the questions how it will be addressed. Peace and security, as Jean-Victor mentioned, is actually the purview of the Security Council. And now it's also in the field of economic and social development. So I think that's still being essentially worked out how that exactly will work. So I think that's challenging because it's also a politically sensitive issue, but also because it's just very difficult to achieve. And if the conflict parties don't want to resolve the issue, it's very hard for the UN to do something. So that's, I think, the challenging one. On the positive, sort of the one I'm optimistic for, I mean, I would hope that the goal on education will be pushed very strongly by countries because, I mean, it's one thing which is affecting both developing and developed countries. I mean, if you think of youth unemployment, that's a big issue, I think, again, for both countries. So I think there's a common ground, which means I think there will be a big push. And it's something where countries, I think, a lot of the, a question that Jean-Victor raised, what can we do to prevent sort of these kind of conflicts? I mean, there's no silver bullet, but in a sense, in one way, sort of achieving these SDGs is part of the answer, because they address many of the root causes, like inequality, like corrupt institutions, like favoring certain ethnic groups, not others, and also people don't seeing a future and a perspective. So I think, especially the youth goal, extremism that sort of sits with young people, I think does result from not having a perspective. So I think that one, the education one, which leads to employment and sort of opportunities in life, I think that's very important, and I think that's why it's something which will be sort of pushed forward, yeah.
Thank you. So some audience questions? Sebastian?
I have two questions, if that's all right for
That's
each
fine.
of the speakers. First, for Matthias, I would like to know regarding the Paris Convention that you briefly discussed. Knowing what has happened in Tokyo, in Copenhagen, in Cancun, in the previous conventions, and how developing countries usually feel like they're being undermined, whereas big countries, powerhouses like the US and China, only sign with various restrictions. How do you think that the UN will go about with this Paris Convention this year, and regarding the SDGs for 2030?
I mean, I think generally there is a strong sense of optimism, because I think now, compared to, let's say, 5 years ago, there is a stronger sense of urgency by countries to come up with a convincing climate deal. And of course, countries started much earlier than they did in the past. I mean, for months now, they have actually, been coming together in working groups to discuss commitments that they'll be making. And I don't know details, but what I do hear from people involved in this is that people are bringing something to the table. So I think there's generally a stronger sense of urgency than in the past. And also because the United States and China did signal a commitment to reducing carbon emissions in the long term. So I think that's always a key, and that in the past, when big countries didn't make commitments, then other countries, of course, say, well, then we won't make commitments either. But it seems like major players now are actually committing themselves. So it's always this knock-on effect. And I think from what I hear, there's enough countries, big countries, willing to commit themselves that should also pull others to commit themselves. So that's why I think there's reason for optimism.
Allow me, Sebastian, to add something to what Matthias has just said. I would like to give you a very palpable example of what climate change means and what's the difficulty of reaching this treaty. I come from the heart of the Cameroon Equatorial Forest, a small village of about 40 houses. And in that village, we are no more than 120 people, roughly. I fought personally because I happen to work abroad. They know me. Maybe I have a bit of influence on the local people who rule the place there. So I said, we have a heavy truck that passes in front of this village like 2 or 3 times a day. It destroys the roads. It throws dust on our plantations. What are these trucks carrying? These trucks are carrying our trees. In my village, we have trees that are so big, so huge, and take so long to grow, and it is a pain to see them go. So I manage with the local leaders of our village to obtain that those people who have invested in agro-pastoral factories and who are cutting the trees, who are exporting timber, at least will give something back to those villagers who have nothing and who have no voice. Give them some corrugated roof. Give them a few fields for young people so that they can play soccer or football. Give them some means so that schools can have stronger walls and a roof. Few things. Now you are going to have a climate change discussion in Paris. 80 world leaders are expected. What should I tell people in my village? Do we stop cutting the trees? Should I stop talking to the young people who are ready to start some kind of campaign to stop trucks going into the bush with the possibility of creating violence, initiating violence, so that this truck will not pass and people will bring in soldiers so that these trucks will pass because these people have a license to go and cut timber? Or do I tell people that, okay, we will let trees being cut, but you are going to have better corrugated roofs, better houses, maybe a better school. So the choices are not easy. At the end of the day, those who exploit and export timber, those who send their kids to school and so on, we have to find a way where everyone wins so that it is lasting. Who can replant trees? Who can guarantee that? Who can bring the seeds? And who can make sure that trees are not cut in a very disorganized, in a very irrespectuous way of the nature? All that must be done. And governments alone will not do that. Civil societies, representatives of villagers, we must all chip in. That is why, no matter what is agreed in Paris, at the end of the day, just like with every agreement, the financing of the agreement, the equal sharing of the burden, and for your information, Africa, and up to some extent, Brazil and Amazonia, we possess the greatest wealth in terms of green nature that help the world respire fresh air. And yet, Africa is not the creator of the greatest amount of carbon dioxide. So there have to be a re-equilibration, a sharing of the responsibilities that is fair. Until and unless that is done, I fear that tomorrow's war, and I'm talking here in my personal capacity, it's not going to be terrorism or religion. Wait when you have war on waters, on forests, on the environment. Then it will be a war that will be terrible, and we don't want to get there.
One of the events that the UN didn't seem particularly effective at was in Darfur, or at least as I was reading about it. And I'm wondering what insight you might be able to offer for how the UN acted, what they could have done differently, and what the status of it is today. I haven't read anything about Darfur for a while.
Thank you very much. This is a very important and difficult question. First, Darfur is part of one of the largest countries in Africa, Sudan. Sudan has a border with 11 other African countries. And over the past 10 years, Sudan has gone through the conclusion of what was one of the most brutal civil wars in Africa. That ended with the independence of one chunk of Sudan, which is now called South Sudan. It is now a member state of the United Nations. Darfur is a totally separate territory in its own right, but part of Sudan. I spoke about peacekeeping operations, and the mission in Darfur is indeed a very special one because of its difficulty. It is one of the few hybrid missions of the UN. In other words, the UN has joined forces with another important regional organization, in this case, the African Union. So the UN has in Darfur a hybrid mission with the African Union. The difficulty comes from the fact that the UN has redone what it's called. But as I said, the onus really again in Darfur, just like in many other places, is on Sudanese themselves to first and foremost agree on making peace or stopping the fight against each other. We have done what we could. I think that the international community has even gone as far as indicting the president of the Sudan. And yesterday, one country was asking India, where the president of Sudan has gone to this African summit with India to arrest and extradite or send the president. That was also the case when the president of Sudan traveled to South Africa a few weeks back. Now, who are we to oblige a sovereign independent state, in this case India, and a few weeks ago it was South Africa, to do what they don't want to do? Now, we have international tribunals. We have done what we could. And civil society, including the creative community, in this case, very prominent celebrities, have joined the fray in order to do something about Darfur. But the UN can only keep peace where there is peace to keep. But I agree, on the humanitarian front, we have done a lot. We have put people in refugee camps rather than them dying of thirst or hunger in the desert. One key problem of the Darfur, which is not highlighted enough, is water. Lack of water. It is a desert. And then Darfur is a conglomerate of complex tribes who change allegiances. Now, whether it is the UN or any other organization, it will be very difficult to untangle that. Really, the Sudanese have to address. But you know, no condition is permanent. The UN will keep on doing what we can do. But again, what is the UN? What we do can only be supported, and the means will have to come from the strength that the Security Council provides. And sometimes in some conflict, the Security Council does less or does more. But they do what they believe they should do. Some countries have a veto right, others have. And as you know, Sudan produces now a lot of oil, just like South Sudan. So when you put all that together, it is not easy. It really is not.
I think we have time for one or two more questions over here.
Hello, is this on?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm an agricultural economist who worked overseas in developing countries, a professor, and also was 5 years with FAO headquarters in Rome, but a lot of grassroots. So what I want to talk about is this number 17 of your goals, which has to do with reforms and how the UN does. And tonight has been a breath of fresh air to see you talk informally and interact, because so much of what we have seen in the UN is the style of set speeches and formal papers and drafting minute. You've been in a lot of that. And I wanted to ask, do you have some company of people like yourselves, both young and older, who are kind of loosening up UN approaches? And I guess my basic question is, are there, maybe at one point it hasn't been made tonight, is that the Security Council General Assembly in New York is not over and above all the other UN agencies. Each Director General is independent, has the same rank as Secretary General, right? So there's a need to how to communicate among organizations And then within an organization, which can be very stiff and hierarchical, line of staff, and then between the UN agencies and the non-UN and so on. Do you have some ideas or hopes, both thinking of at your higher level, and then as you as a younger fellow who may be communicating by Twitter amidst all the formalities? Is there some loosening up of the styles that might lead to more effectiveness of the UN agencies' approaches?
I'll take the privilege of seniority and answer first, and then Matthias will complete what I will say. Thank you so much for that question, and thank you for your service. I would like to agree with you that agriculture, for instance, is very fundamental. It may actually be able by itself to reduce conflicts and war. I don't know of many people when they have a full belly and when the children go to school, when they have good health, will accept to go to war just for the sake of going to war. But when you have a bunch of hungry people, you can very easily tell them, let's go to that village, to that house. They have chicken, they have goats, they have other cattle. Let's go there and we'll eat. Sometimes war will start very easily. Now, your question is so well put, but agriculture in itself and what countries can produce and the work that agency can do mean nothing if countries do not interact with each other and if you do not have an infrastructural development that will sustain that economy and that will sustain the goals that Matthias so well presented here. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is, both in size and in human population, the equivalent of part of Western Europe, but no roads. Now, the Congo can export food to Europe if only they had infrastructure. The country is so green, it has the first or the second higher potential in terms of hydropower, rivers, and so on in the whole world. The Congo can export electricity to the whole of Africa with one single dam, the Inga project. If the Inga project, which is 40 years old, was completed, the Congo will export electricity to Western Europe. But no roads, no infrastructure. This is a country that is wealthy. I worked in the Kasai, one of the biggest diamond producing area. No roads, but aircraft can land on a small land strip and take diamonds to Antwerp, to Amsterdam, to Brussels, to Tel Aviv. And yet people there don't eat, don't have hospitals. And yet this is the highest diamond producing area. Now for the agencies and for the leadership, most of these agencies still have to come and report to the General Assembly. And the interaction is actually more complex than that because sometimes there are problems of funding. Sometimes wealthy countries say, no, we have a new priority, or no, our population don't want us to do what we are doing. There was a vote in Switzerland a few days ago where they have decided not to support immigration. So you cannot have these politicians going against the will of the people. Otherwise, they'll be elected out of office. Now, are they people who will do what I do? I do what I do because I'm a bit crazy, but also because I was a journalist before and I was a war correspondent. So I've kind of developed this way of interacting and speaking and saying things the way I see them. But at the end of the day, just like in Haiti, people, even though they are poor, they can defeat poverty. They can defeat, if they so wish, they can defeat colonization. The Haitians managed to defeat the French. But then, how did they transform this victory into a succession of nightmares? Because they did not manage to protect the weakest among the population. Those even won the war against slavery ended up becoming dictators. So the challenge really is not to expect the UN to come and solve things. The challenge is for us to work toward a day where UN agencies will no longer be needed. And my opinion is that the first responsibility rests with the people. They have to work, both the leaders and those who are led, both the rulers and those who are ruled. They all have to work to understand that it is not a good thing to have people coming from New York or from I don't know where and come and tell you what to do, how to run your elections, how to conduct your lives. It is not a good thing, but sometimes that is necessary. But the world today is still a complex place, but I'm sure Matthias would like to add to the goals.
Yes, I'll add a couple of things. On the coordination between the agencies, from what I saw, it worked quite well with the goals, and that goes back to what I said about ownership. There was actually an interagency task force, they called it, of the Secretariat, FAO, WHO, and other agencies, where they produced what they called issue briefs on various issues covered in the goals, on hunger, on poverty, on health, on water and sanitation. And so there was actually quite good cooperation between the agencies. So I think that was important also in the spirit of actually implementing the goals, because all of these will have roles. So I think there is good coordination going on, but it's a continuing challenge, of course, because there are many. But that worked quite well. When it comes to sort of more exciting formats, there's actually a new forum was created to review these goals on a global level, which will take place every year or once a year. The High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. And for that, we are actually thinking of making it more interesting, because you're right, very often these meetings take the form of member states making statements, and one after the other, and it's not the most exciting format for people watching. So, but there are ideas to have to add elements of TED Talks, for example, or to have more interactive formats using social media. Actually, having people from the outside send in questions and having them answered live by people in the panel. So there is thinking to that, because of course for our work it's important that on the one side people are interested and watch, the general public, stakeholders, but also that we attract policy or decision makers from member states. It's very important to have representatives from the missions in New York at these meetings, but it's also important to have people from the member states themselves, the people who sit in the ministries and make the policies, for them to interact and to give them this forum as well. So it should be interesting for them as well. So I think on the sort of loosening up creativity, we're trying. And on the interaction between the agencies, I think from what I can see, it's also going in a good direction.
Just an addendum with Erin's permission. I would not like to leave this hall with an impression behind me that all is gloom and doom. Actually, since I joined the United Nations, up to this day, I've actually seen more progress. We talk about Africa. Africa constitutes about 70% of the work of the Security Council. That's true. But when you come to think about it, there are 53 countries in Africa, 54 if you count Western Sahara, which is a member state of the African Union, but not, at least not yet, a member state of the United Nations. But we speak a lot about the Congo, the war in Mali, situations with Ebola and so on. But think about the many other African countries where things work. Think about other parts of the world where things have changed. South Korea was not where it is today 40, 50 years ago. Think that today in Ethiopia, when I was still with the BBC 30 years ago, Michael Burke did a wonderful documentary on the famine in Ethiopia. He called it a famine of biblical proportions, because people had to line up children, women in a village, and they had to decide who will eat and who will die. And you had tens of thousands of people going through that. But today, there is a light train being built in Addis Ababa. Today, Ethiopia has just completed a major dam that will change the geography, that will change trade in the sub-region. Today, South Africa. I'm old enough to remember the days when people were telling us, oh, this whole thing about apartheid, it will never end, or it will end in a bloodbath. But you had two leaders, Nelson Mandela and de Klerk, who stood up and said, let us lock each other in a room, and we get out of there when we can agree that we agree. It was not easy. That room was called the Rote Schuur, and it led to the Rote Schuur Agreement, which led to the liberation of Mandela. But you need many Mandela today. People who will say it is not about them, who will say, I'd rather stay in jail until and unless this injustice is undone. Today in Africa, you have many countries who are now going through democratic elections. We spoke about Cote d'Ivoire. This week, Tanzania. Elections all over the place. But you happen to hear more frequently about countries, and there are about 7 or 10 of them out of 54, where things don't work. Sometimes things go very bad, but there are many countries you don't hear about. Botswana, more or less well managed, developed. South Africa, trying hard, not easy. Mozambique, coming out of a nightmare, going ahead. Senegal, pluralistic changes regularly. And so even Mali, that is at war. Many countries are doing this. Look at the world. Things are changing. The only peace operation in the Western Hemisphere is Haiti. That's good. There are still a few missions in Kosovo. But even there, progress is being made. So it is not all doom and gloom. There is hope. But we are all in this. It does not concern the UN only. It also concerns students, leaders, religious leaders, civil society. The situation in Mozambique was changed because a religious community called upon leaders who took their responsibilities, who agreed to negotiate, who then in turn called the United Nations, who took their responsibility, who sent peacekeepers and civilian workers. And then the population themselves said, we don't want to fight anymore. We want to vote. We want to elect our leaders. And today, since 1992, you have the third president in Mozambique. And you have toll roads in a country where you had no roads in 1992. So this is the situation. Not all is gloom and doom. It is like, peace is like raising a child. It takes a village.
I think that's the perfect note to end on. I'd like to, of course, thank our two speakers, but before I do that, I'd also like to thank Ji-Hae Shin, who is from the Public Information Office at the United Nations and who helped organize tonight's event. And of course, to Matthias and John Victor, thank you for a great evening and for sharing with us your insights from your longer career and your just starting off in the career. And
his career will be even longer, trust me.
I'm afraid it probably will.
Thank you all.